Alright guys, so let's move on to the lens correction panel where we're basically going to be making adjustments to correct distortion as well as vignetting as well as chromatic aberration that's created from different lenses. The best way to do this is probably to switch this image of the stadium right here, which is image number 10. This image was shot on a fisheye, so there's clearly going to be a lot of distortion because that's just how fisheyes are. They create that kind of cool fisheye effect. Now we can correct that distortion one of two ways. We can either do it manually and make these adjustments ourselves, or we can do it by using lens profiles. And this is a really cool feature. We'll show you guys how to do it manually in a second, but I want to show you these profile adjustments. So if I switch to profile right here, and then I click on Enable Profile Corrections, what it's going to do is it's going to detect which lens that I use, and it's going to automatically create a distortion correction to basically straighten out all the lines and correct all the distortion that's created from that lens. So watch the magic. I'm going to click it, and automatically basically it straightens out this line right here, it flattens out my horizon, it creates basically a wide angle image from that fisheye shot. And check it out, it knows basically that I shot it on a Canon, it was on a EF 15mm f2.8 on a 5D Mark II. It uses all of the metadata information to detect the lens, and you can look at how many different lens profiles there are. So these are all the different makes for lens profiles, and then these are all the different models. So essentially every single model of lens is going to be available, at least for the popular sets of DSLRs, is going to be available inside of Lightroom, and so you can do these automatic lens corrections. And then basically from here you can make adjustments to, like little micro adjustments to adjust the distortion as well as the chromatic aberration as well as the vignetting, which are going to work the same way as they are in manual. So let's disable this and switch back to manual and kind of teach you these functions individually. Alright, so let's first go over these transform sliders. And basically under the transform sliders you have different options to deal with the distortion effects that are created by lenses themselves, as well as perspective distortion, like if you're shooting bottom up on a building, or if you're shooting top down on something, or if it's just dealing with the distance between you and the subject that you're shooting and kind of the lens that you're using. So starting with distortion slider first, as I adjust to the left, it's basically going to increase the center, the size of the center, as while keeping kind of the edges the same size. As I go to the right side, it's going to shrink the center while pulling in the outside edges. So typically if you have like pictures of portraits or something like that and you shot it maybe on a 24-70 or maybe a lens that might have a little bit of distortion and people might look a little funny, you're going to use the distortion to kind of even it out, to kind of make them look a little right. Or maybe for buildings, if you have kind of bulging lines on a building, you can use that distortion to kind of straighten out those edges. So the vertical slider is going to be used for correcting lens distortion that's created from shooting from certain angles. So shooting bottom up or top down on objects, like bottom up from a building, you're going to use a vertical slider, and you're just going to basically slide it in either direction to correct that vertical perspective line distortion on the lens. Do remember that if you are planning on using the vertical slider or any of these transform sliders to basically correct this distortion, you want to leave a little bit of space around the image, because as I make adjustments, you'll notice how I'm losing pixels in the image. So if you frame the building or if you frame whatever you're shooting too close to the edges, you're going to cut off those edges. Alright, now moving to our next slider, the horizontal slider is dealing with shooting objects from side angles. Basically, you're correcting for shooting from the left or the right, and you want to kind of straighten out those side angles. With each one of these, they're really pretty self-explanatory. We'll have tutorials on actually fixing specific types of distortion, but once you load up an image that has distortion, if you do a little bit of playing around, you'll notice exactly how to fix it. Now with rotate, it's kind of similar to rotating with a cropping tool, except you're not actually changing the crop. You're just rotating the image within the actual within the actual crop itself. And then with scale, you're shrinking the image within the actual crop itself. If you have constrained crop turned on, this is going to constrain the original crop to fit the edges of the image. Alright, so let's reset everything we just did. We're going to reset the entire image by hitting reset. Alright, so let's talk about lens vignetting. Now, this type of lens vignetting is actually meant to correct the vignette that's naturally created by different types of lenses. But you can use it artistically as well. In fact, I prefer to use this form of vignetting over the post-crop vignette, just because it's a more subtle effect. But if I drag to the right, it's going to brighten my edges, and if I drag to the left, it's going to darken my edges. And the nice thing about this type of vignetting is you're basically just brightening or darkening the colors around the edges of the frame, as opposed to adding like an artificial vignette. But you do want to be careful if you're adding a lot of brightness to an area that might, like let's say this image was shot at 1600 ISO. Actually, let's just pick one that was shot at a high ISO. Let's go to this one. So if I increase the amount of vignette to plus 100, you'll notice that it's going to increase the noise around the edges significantly because it's actually brightening the edges of the image. So if this image is shot at ISO 5000, it's equivalent to actually just increasing the exposure around the edges, which is going to make it really, really noisy. So do be aware of that. Dragging it to the left is going to darken the edges, and then the midpoint is going to basically pull in or out the midpoint of the vignette. So as I go to the left, it brings the midpoint into the center, basically darkening everything and pulling it into that center point right here. As I pull it out, it brings the midpoint out and it affects more so the edges until I'm at the very end, which is 100, and it's affecting only the edges of the image. Alright, so I'm going to hold Alt and click Reset to reset my lens vignetting. Let's move on to Chromatic Aberration. Now, I don't think in this grouping of images that I actually have any images that have a significant amount of chromatic aberration. But basically what that is you'll notice that like if you're shooting with certain types of lenses, around edges, particularly where there's highlights, like where there's a bright area around a dark edge, you might notice a chromatic aberration where you see like a blue or a red or yellow color along those edges. That's the chromatic aberration. You see this kind of edge halo. You can fix that by adjusting up or down on red or cyan. Depending on what color the chromatic aberration is, you want to adjust accordingly. So if you're seeing a red chromatic aberration, you're going to adjust the red cyan. If you see a blue or yellow, you're going to adjust from the blue or yellow. Now defringe is going to remove that like little fringe edge around those objects, and you can set different settings for that. One is around highlight edges or one is around all edges. So highlight edges are basically around objects that are basically in front of a highlight, like this edge right here, and one is around all edges, which is basically regardless of what edge it is, it's going to try and remove that fringing effect. Alright guys, so let's move on to the effects panel.